Our next speaker knows how to make a difference in young children's lives. She spent more than 15 years dedicated to the early childhood movement in Arizona and now serves as the executive director of the National Association for the Education of Young Children. It is my pleasure to introduce Rhian Evans Allvin. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good morning. It is terrific to be with all of you. And Governor Sandoval, your leadership in early childhood education is certainly noteworthy. And from all of us across the country who care deeply about this issue, thank you for taking the lead on such an important topic for young kids in the state, in your state. It's terrific to be with all of you. As Governor Sandoval mentioned, prior to moving to Washington 2 years ago, I spent my career in early childhood education working at state level policy in Arizona. And so the work that you all are doing is near and dear to my heart. And my interest in early childhood education actually began in higher education, where I started doing policy work in higher education, and I quickly realized that I needed to leap to early childhood education because the path for success and opportunity and access to post-secondary education begins very, very early. So as state leaders, you each have a significant opportunity to impact many, many outcomes for young children. I am following closely this new movement in early childhood around maker learning or maker education, and I think about how incredible it is to visit classrooms that are doing maker learning. And very few times as an adult do you have the opportunity to be involved in a maker learning environment. And I would argue that this moment right now in early childhood education and the connections into K-12 is just that opportunity. We don't have a blank slate, but we have close to a blank slate, and we really can be innovative, imaginative thinkers in this space. And my objective today is to give you some more information about how to do that well. So this is an unprecedented time in the field of early learning. At the federal, state, local levels, elected officials in red and blue states are paying significant attention to early learning. This includes many of you in this room: governors, legislators, superintendents of public instruction, county boards of supervisors, mayors, members of Congress, and the White House. And the commitments include increased funding, they include better system alignment, and a growing recognition that success must include a commitment to quality. The data tells us that it's not just any early learning environment that changes outcomes. It is high quality early learning environments. And I commend each of you for your individual and collective commitments to ensure that our nation's youngest children are our moral, education, and economic priorities. So very quickly about the National Association for the Education of Young Children. We're actually almost 90 years old. We have about 65,000 members. They're early childhood educators, they're faculty, they're system leaders, they're advocates. And our two absolute top priorities are that children birth through age 8 have equitable access to developmentally appropriate, high quality early learning, and that the early childhood education profession exemplifies excellence and is recognized as vital and performing a critical role in society. We have a long way to go on both of those topics. So ECS asked me to talk today about how to approach early learning systems building and the potential opportunities to create better alignment between early learning and K-12 education. So I thought to begin, I'd give you some context about what exists today. As developers and brokers of education policy, why should you care about early childhood education? For many of us who are parents, grandparents, former teachers, it may be obvious. You know, when you get down on the floor to play with an infant or toddler and they roll the ball back to you for the first time, or their babbling slowly turns into dada, we know that something significant is occurring inside their brains. But in the past 20 years, neuroscience has confirmed what social science has long suspected, that during the first 5 years of a child's life, there's an unprecedented explosion of brain activity. This is when all the fundamentals of language are developed, when children are developing their fine and gross motor skills, when they're having their first and most impressionable social, emotional, or bonding experiences. And the more recent neuroscience has confirmed that all of the foundations for executive functioning begin in these first 5 years as well. Executive functions are the ability to control emotions. They're the ability to follow instructions, to conduct logical reasoning, to multitask. And what may seem like a basic game of Simon Says in a preschool classroom exposes children to the very skills that 21st century employers say are the very most important. The second development in the past 20 years has been the confirmation of the economics of early learning. Nobel laureate economist James Heckman, the former vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Art Rolnick, have both demonstrated the economic modeling that points to anywhere between a $7 and $16 return on investment. Third, the standards and accountability movement in K-12 education is really driving this push towards early learning. I have a 6, 7, and 9-year-old, Austin, Eli, and Isabel, and I can assure you that the kindergarten classes they each entered were light years from the kindergarten I was exposed to some 35 years ago. We have incredibly high expectations of 5-year-olds, incredibly high expectations of 5-year-olds, regardless of what vulnerabilities exist in their lives. And many hit the ground running. They're prepared for those expectations, while others really enter struggling and rarely catch up. In order to decode and understand phonics, children must have strong language foundations. In order to be able to count to 100, skipping by tens, children have to have been exposed to basic math concepts like counting, like stacking blocks, like sorting objects. Finally, going back to the moral imperative on which this country was founded, is the basic issue of fairness. We have always held high the notion that everyone has the chance to be successful, to live the American dream. I once heard a Fortune 500 CEO liken this concept to a game of Monopoly. Everyone starts go with $200. As you go around the board, it's a matter of choice and it's a matter of chance. But everyone starts go with $200. And that is fundamentally still not happening in the sphere of early childhood education. So what's our path to progress? Arguably, for families and children, there should be no gaps between early learning and K-12 education. As a parent of a 4-year-old, you don't suddenly think, oh my gosh, this needs to be completely different in K-12 education. Yet the systems are completely different. Their history, their governance, their scale, their professional workforce. When we talk about alignment between early learning and K-12 education, I think of that iconic image of the railroad tracks being built from opposite ends of the country and getting to the middle and realizing that they're off by about a mile from the north to the south and not connecting. So let's talk a little bit about where children are right now. Most young children in the United States spend at least a portion of their day in an out-of-home setting. And while we're investing significant public dollars, less than half of children eligible are in a Head Start program. About 4% of 3-year-olds are being served by a public funding stream. About 28% of 4-year-olds are being served in state-funded pre-K programs. And we are at an all-time low in the number of children being served through the Child Care Development Block Grant. It's very, very difficult to find the right data to provide an accurate picture of where young children spend their days. You'd think we'd be able to answer the question, well, where are children? Where do they spend their days? It's a very, very difficult question to answer, primarily because any one child is in multiple locations, being funded through multiple and often disparate funding streams. And it's different from K-12 education in that early learning is a market-driven industry. It's a market-driven industry. For some families who access the market, their most pressing need is to ensure that their children are safe while they work. For others, they have more economic flexibility, and they're looking for a half-day preschool or some enrichment programs. These goals have driven us to create incredibly fragmented funding streams, some designed as a workforce necessity, others designed for high-quality early learning. And each of them have their own regulatory obligations. When you think about this movement in preschool, it is very, very new, obviously. And if you go back to the beginning of the history of early childhood education, other than the families who could economically afford it, early childhood education was simply about keeping kids safe while their parents work. The one program, Head Start, that was designed in the late 60s to combat the war on poverty had a lens towards high-quality early learning. But this recent neuroscience, the economic undergirding, have really pointed us in the direction from a policy perspective that we have got to marry the goals of keeping kids safe while their parents work and making sure that we're capitalizing on this time in a child's life. The truth is, parents need both. Parents should be able to expect that their children are safe while they work and that they are in high-quality early learning environments. After all, that's what most parents' expectations are of the K-12 system. In many states, we're looking at consolidating different programs, and I think it's something that we need to be really careful about to push kids into different settings depending upon what age they are. It potentially is detrimental to a very diverse system that currently focuses on parent choice. I would also argue that despite the setting in this list across the slide, that you can achieve the kind of quality that changes outcomes for young kids with the right policies in any one of those settings. It's also important to recognize that this marketplace or industry is predominantly private sector business, the vast majority of which are one or two child care or preschool locations or family child care homes. Again, most young children are experiencing childcare and preschool in the same setting, yet public funding streams are widely disconnected. So while public funding has increased substantially in recent years, families still pay the majority of the bill. Last year, it was $30 billion that families were paying to access high-quality early learning. And this is an expensive proposition for most families. It's more expensive than college tuition at a public university. So, oops, sorry, get back here. I want to make a note on this slide. The private piece includes United Way funding, it includes philanthropy. The philanthropic sector has been incredibly important in moving early childhood education, but it's a very small portion of what families spend. Also, we think about early learning from birth to age 5, birth to age 8 actually, but for early learning settings, birth to 5, you can see the wide disparity in what families pay. Anywhere from $3,000, almost $4,000 to more than $16,000 for an infant. And for preschoolers, anywhere from almost $4,000 to upwards of $12,000, depending upon what type of setting they're in, what their economic affordability is, and what part of the country that they're in. So, while public funding has increased substantially, parents are still paying a lot. And the other piece that's really important to this economic equation is the early childhood workforce. If there's one thing that keeps me up at night, it's thinking about our obligation as an early childhood field to deliver on the promise of early learning. We now have business leaders saying early childhood education is the right thing to do. We have education leaders, we have governors, we have military leaders saying that early education is the right thing to do. We have law enforcement saying it's the answer to reduce crime. We, as an early childhood field, have an obligation to deliver on that promise of early learning. We've established that the stakes are high, and as more and more states and the federal government invest in this value proposition, we as a field have to deliver. There's a significant disconnect right now between the sophistication that's required in the classroom and the brain science and the skills and competencies we require of early educators. While more and more state-funded preschool programs are requiring degrees, most states have very low expectations of childcare staff, which is where, again, most children spend their day. Many states, the requirement is that the teachers have a high school diploma, be free of tuberculosis, and be fingerprinted. Half of our workforce is in a formal setting, so a preschool classroom, a Head Start, a for-profit childcare center, a not-for-profit childcare center, a church, a synagogue. And the other half of our workforce, up to 1 million people, are in family childcare homes where many children are receiving their preschool experience. The vast majority of our workforce do not have college degrees, and their average wages are about $10.60 per hour. So given the statistics and the status of our non-system in early childhood education, how do we build a system that is designed to connect into K-12 education? Early learning is relatively new to the notion of building a system. I mean, there are K-12 education systems, uneven as they may be, have existed for centuries, and many other systems exist across the globe, transportation systems. The whole idea of building a system is really new in early childhood education, and it's really only been in the last 20 years that the concept has taken root. The good news is that thinking like system builders has helped us to catapult progress and to build public will and to build investment from states and the federal government. And really, there are multiple systems within systems. But for the sake of simplicity, these four ovals represent the sectors in the early childhood systems that if they're all aligned and working effectively together, they're the primary drivers for ensuring young children walk into kindergarten on the first day of school prepared for success. I'm going to focus on the early learning oval as the critical first step to align the systems, but a lot of states are knee-deep in connecting the dots between all four of those systems. So, as policymakers, there are some key principles. Hang on a minute. As policymakers, there are some key principles to keep in mind as you're building these systems. The first principle I want you to think about is aligning access and quality. You know, when you look at the research that the early childhood field hangs its hat on, these longitudinal studies, the High Scope Perry Preschool study, the Abecedarian Project study in North Carolina, the Chicago Parent-Child Centers, all of them had significant investments in quality. They had bachelor or master degree teachers. They had wraparound programs for kids. They had home visiting that was part of the effort. So there was a significant investment in quality in those programs. We paid attention to serving vulnerable children and matching up the dosage of what kids need and the vulnerabilities that exist in their life are incredibly important. We cannot sacrifice quality for access. And I know in states across the country right now, there is huge pressure. There's huge pressure to count the number of children that you're serving, which is really important because we're nowhere near any kind of scale. But I will also tell you, with my research hat on, with a data hat on, that if we are simply counting the number of children who are in the program without the right safeguards to quality, then we're not going to find the kinds of outcomes that we all want to have happen in the next 20 years. The second piece, as you're thinking about it, is that as you design these systems, making sure that we're aligning the goals of keeping kids safe while their parents work and providing a high-quality early learning experience at the same time. Both of those goals can be met simultaneously, and it's how we're going to get the kind of kindergarten readiness outcomes that we're all looking for. The other piece that I want to emphasize is parent choice. In some ways, I know that's a hot topic in K-12 education, and in some ways, the early childhood system epitomizes pure parent choice. And that has to be, the notion of parent choice has to be an essential ingredient in how we access the system. For some parents, they want a program that is near their house. For other parents, they want a program that is near where they work. Some parents want a play-based environment. Other parents want a Montessori type environment. We're all over the map. And allowing parents the opportunity of choice is really important in designing the systems that we're creating. And most parents in this country today need full day, full year care. And so they'll continue to cobble together a variety of settings, a preschool program in the morning, at Tia or Tio's house or grandmother's house in the afternoon, and making sure that we're aligning our policy and our systems to provide that kind of flexibility is very important. The other piece about choice that I want to mention is that low-income families, while we argue that they have choice, they really don't. They really don't. If you look at all of the studies with parents and choosing quality or choosing the setting that they're in for early learning, it is completely economically driven. It is driven by what they can afford. And even parents who want a Montessori, they can't pay $12,000 a year for their children to access the Montessori. So they may be in family child care because it's cheaper. And so when we think about parent choice, the goal is to allow parents of all socioeconomic levels to choose from quality to quality, that they're choosing among options, all of which will provide high quality early learning and kindergarten readiness for young children. The other piece to think about is scale. In order to get to the point in this country where we're actually changing child-level outcomes, third grade reading scores, kindergarten readiness scores, graduation rates, there has got to be a level of scale to get to those child-level outcomes. And at this point, I would arguably say that there is not a state in the country that has reached the kind of scale that's at this point going to lead to mass child-level outcomes. We have a long way to go to reach that level of scale. And so we've got to continue to think about the investment in early childhood education that's both beneficial for the children and families and beneficial for the public good. And that's going to take the leadership of governors, of superintendents of public instruction, of folks sitting in this room who can make the case that it's the right social investment, it's the right economic investment to make. The next piece I want to think about is overcoming funding silos. So right now, because of the disparity in the funding streams, there is huge disparity in the types of programs and in the siloed nature of how they exist. It is not uncommon to go into a public school with 3- and 4-year-olds in a preschool classroom and have them take you to their Title I funded classroom, and then take you to their state-funded pre-K classroom, and then take you to their parent fee classroom, to take you to their classroom that is funded by local money, and that because the regulatory process, because of the obligations we put in place are so completely different, that we've created these silo environments. That is ridiculous public policy. That's ineffective. It's certainly not helping to bring scale. And it just doesn't make sense to have this kind of siloed approach. And so as you're thinking about designing policies, you're at a perfect place at state level policy to think about how to align the regulatory burden among and between these programs so that the programs on the ground in local communities delivering on this are able to piece it together in a way that makes economic sense and that it makes sense for families. The other example I've started to see, which is so refreshing, is a lot more intentionality in the alignment between Head Start and Child Care Development Block Grant money, so that most children who are having a half-day Head Start experience are then able to, because it's state-enabled, the regulatory system at the state level allows programs to take Child Care Development Block Grant money and wrap it around a Head Start program so that there's a continuum of care across the year and across the day. The other piece that's really important is teaching and leading. And we know that the excellence that's going to occur in terms of quality is going to happen in the classroom with extraordinary teachers. And right now, while there is often very few pathways to teaching in K-12 education, there are a myriad of pathways in early childhood education. but they're still, my theme, they're very disconnected. A lot of the early childhood workforce don't start out as individuals who think they're college bound or college worthy. They start out working in a child care center. They may be 50 years old and going back to school. Many of them start through an associate's degree program. And while significant progress has been made in articulation agreements, it is very common to come across early childhood educators who are floating around with 165 credits in an associate's degree program that won't articulate to a bachelor's degree program. And so creating state policy that aligns this articulation and acknowledges that most early childhood educators are kind of coming into higher education with less intentionality than other types of workforces is really important. The other thing that I would encourage you, especially those of you who are developing really gung-ho developing pre-K programs, because so many of them are aligned to public school systems, there's oftentimes a path towards traditional teacher certification through colleges of education, that in order to become a preschool teacher, you've got to have a teacher education degree, and you have to be certified. I would urge you to think about some creative opportunities. Many of the best early childhood educators are coming out of consumer and family study programs, the old home economic programs, child development programs. And I would argue that states that are being the most innovative, that are creating the most diverse pathways, are acknowledging that there's a piece of early childhood education pedagogy that exists in colleges of education, and there's a piece of early childhood pedagogy that exists in child and human development, especially for younger kids. And to think about ways to connecting the dots in higher ed systems, I see more and more four-year higher ed programs that have actually taken child development and put it into a piece of their college of education, or it's a track within education. But think about how those pieces can align, because if you take out the family studies, you're losing some of what we know to be the best about how young kids learn and develop, which is so critical in high-quality early learning settings. The other piece related to higher education is this notion that family child care homes are half of the workforce. And if you develop your system where you acknowledge that quality can exist in licensed and regulated family child care homes, and early learning, infant toddler care, and preschool can actually exist in those settings, it's an economic driver for those primarily women who are working, who have created a home-based business. It's micro-enterprise for women. And if you create the system that they see themselves in, there's a huge opportunity for progression in higher education and economic development. Many states are aligning their family child care homes with their public preschools, with their child care, and more family child care home providers are seeing themselves as part of a professional workforce, which it's not just we're babysitting to make sure that the neighbor down the street can go to work, but that we're part of a professional workforce. And state policy can instigate that, and it can support it, and it can really develop micro-enterprise opportunities around the state. The other piece to think about is really focusing on high school students. I know there's great work in vocational and technical education, career and technical education around the country. Think about some of the best lab schools I've seen in early childhood are either on a campus of associate's degree program, or a high school degree, or a high school campus, where you're actually showing and demonstrating what quality is and helping high school students find a path to a career. There's some brilliant work going on in that area. And then the final thing I would say, and I know many of your sessions or some of your sessions have focused on this, is financial aid in higher education. It's really tough to recruit a well-qualified, well-educated workforce when the promise at the end of it is going to be a $30,000 a year job. And so to really focus on higher education, and even some of these types of programs where you commit, if your college is paid for, you commit then to 2 years of service or work in the field or working in a rural community, some creative opportunities to really drive the workforce into early learning. what we have found as standards have increased, so a lot of pre-K programs are now insisting on certifications and bachelor's degree. Head Start now has a requirement on bachelor's degree and certification. And because we haven't changed the economic conditions of early childhood education, we're actually really training and creating the training ground for your K-12 workforce, because they get the degrees, they meet these requirements, they're still getting paid $10.60 an hour. Many of them don't have health insurance, and so what do? They have to feed their families, they get the degrees that we're requiring, and then they move on to K-12 education. Not a bad thing to keep people in the education pipeline, but think about how you create something that's sustainable in early childhood education. I also hope and know that you all are in leadership positions to be thinking about communications and building public will. And we know that there are various messages about early childhood education that align to different audiences. We ran in 2006 a ballot initiative in Arizona that created a new funding, a new tobacco tax for early childhood education. And in 2006, it was passed by only 51% of the vote. It was a narrow statistical margin. We were referred back to the ballot to be eliminated and to have the tax funding swept into the Legislative General Fund in 2010. In 2010, we won the vote with 70% of the vote, and that was across all 15 counties in Arizona. So from Bullhead City in northern Arizona down to Cochise County. And in order to get 70% of the vote in Arizona, it means you're appealing to libertarians, you're appealing to Tea Party members, you're appealing to liberal Democrats, Republicans, independents, many independents. And I'm here to tell you that the messages of early childhood education resonate across audiences if we're sophisticated enough about how we communicate it. We knew in that instance that we had to really target our message to specific audiences. White independent men preferred the notion of brain science. Republican women preferred the notion of the fairness, everyone gets a chance to succeed. And to have that kind of targeting and messaging is really still important to move the early childhood agenda and reach the kind of scale that we're talking about. In order to align to K-12, another important premise is data systems. And I will tell you, particularly for those of you who are sitting in elected seats, this can often be a complicated conversation. I was listening to the Common Core conversation and thinking about this, because the notion of the government gathering data on small children can be off-putting. And we faced that when I was in Arizona, we faced that. And yet, in order to create the kind of taxpayer accountability that we all know we need to have, we've got to be able to show that some of this is working and that there's connectivity. Because of the system building work that's gone on in early childhood in the last 20 years, there is new and really essential opportunity to connect data systems between early childhood education and K-12 education. I mean, imagine if student ID numbers were connected to young children's early childhood experience, what kind of data that could give us, what kind of items that could equip teachers to have as they're thinking about new kindergartners in the classroom and how to scaffold learning and how to customize learning. It's really essential. In order to do data well, the integrity of the data system is really important. The notion of parents being able to opt out of the data system is really important. And the notion of connecting data between K-12 education and the various systems in early childhood is absolutely essential. It also helps us with workforce data. I would argue that we don't go down the path of tying teacher data to student outcomes, but I do think we need to know about our workforce. We need to know if educational attainment ties to quality. We need to know if turnover has an impact on infants and toddlers in preschool classrooms. We need to know about whether or not there are financial incentives that help us attract and retain the best teachers out there. So this data alignment is absolutely essential. Are we reaching the most vulnerable children? If we're producing these mass preschool programs and then we're only reaching children who come from families that could afford to pay for it anyway, have we really done anything to move the public good? Those types of questions are really, really important. Governance. I'm hoping that most audiences find governance rather boring. I'm hoping because you guys are policymakers and governors that you might find it rather interesting. I will tell you that governance is absolutely essential. And as much as it seems wonky and maybe a little boring, to know that there are clear lines of responsibility and authority, and that seems so obvious. I know especially for K-12, you think, seriously, there aren't clear lines of authority and responsibility? There are not. And those clear lines of authority and responsibility have to cut across funding streams, and everyone in the system has to know their role. It is absolutely essential. So if you have one administrator over the child care money, and another administrator over the Title I and the preschool programs, and another person dealing with Head Start, and they all have their own pieces, and they know what their regulatory system is, they know what their financing is, but there is not something coalescing all of that together. This notion of a system alignment, especially among and between early and childhood, and then to even think about system alignment with K-12, it will not happen. And I want to really emphasize the notion, for those of you who are in governors or in governors' offices or superintendents, the power of you anointing somebody to have the X, to have the responsibility to be the conductor of all of these funding streams is absolutely essential. The states where we have seen most progress being made, there are clear lines of authority and there are clear lines of responsibility. And it has to be someone anointed with the political power to be able to say, you know what, we're going to work to move this regulation. We're going to eliminate some of these barriers. And so to have those kinds of chops, to have that kind of designation from the top level elected official, it cannot be underestimated. It's ironic to hear the K-12 community talk about standards, curriculum, and assessment, because there's such angst over it right now in K-12, and this notion that, wow, these are really essential ingredients, but how do we get this right, and how do we not over-test? Probably much to your surprise, early childhood education is very supportive of the notion of standards, curriculum, and assessment. In fact, in NAEYC position statements, we talk a lot about assessment, and I would argue that K-12 can actually learn a lot about how early childhood education does assessment, because forever assessment has done very much with the lens of instructional support. It's been very much with the lens of how do you get this child from this developmental point to that developmental point in the course of the year. It has not been about high stakes testing, but it's really been about why, if you go back to its roots, why assessment or the notion of accountability was developed in the first place. So we believe that assessment is really, really important. We also believe that some of the best quality, high quality classrooms have curriculum. They have an approach to learning. We know what's gonna happen on Monday. We know what's gonna happen on Tuesday. We communicate well with parents. Did you know today that we made homemade paper? And when we made homemade paper in class, Johnny learned all the tactile functions of how to make homemade paper. We mixed ingredients in homemade paper. That kind of intentionality and curriculum is absolutely essential. In 2013, for the very first time, every state in this country that had a pre-K program had standards aligned to the pre-K program, which was a huge step forward. In alignment, the thing to be thinking about and keep in mind is it's not just about, we will be doing a disservice to all that early childhood education has to offer if we just think about taking what has happened in K-12 and just making it a little bit simpler in early learning. There are a lot of principles and premises that are part of the history and the pedagogy of early learning that K-12 has a lot to learn about. And so we believe that where standards, curriculum, and assessment come together, they come together in this space that has to be very intentional. And when you think about the notion of standards, curriculum, and assessment in this market-driven system that I've described to you, it's really difficult to get it right. How do you talk about standards, curriculum, and assessment in family child care homes? How do you talk about and reach standards, curriculum, and assessment conversations in small one-site programs with the church program that's down the street? I can promise you that these programs are hungry to be part of this system and want to participate. but really thinking about it intentionally. And the key player in all of this from a K-12 perspective, when you get to standards, curriculum, and assessment, the key player is the site-based leadership at elementary schools. If you go across your elementary schools in your state, I guarantee you that where you'll see programs doing that alignment well, it's because the site leaders, the principals, have really taken to heart this notion of their catchment area in the community that they serve, and they've reached out to the small nonprofits. They've reached out to the family child care homes. They've created stay-in-plays for the family child care homes. They opened their school libraries to the family child care homes. I interacted with one superintendent who, this sounds so simple, but made such a profound difference, who used the data from vital records to send a letter to every parent of a newborn child in his catchment area in his elementary school. And it said, "Welcome to our learning community. We are so thrilled that you are part of this learning community, and we want you to know what's available on this school campus to serve your babies and to come to the stay and play that our school librarian does. Join us for the Mommy and Me classes that we have." The opportunity for site-based leadership within a district is absolutely essential. As you look at this as these system elements and best practices, many states have used this notion, and I'm sure you've either been involved in creating them or you've heard of them, this notion of quality rating and improvement systems to actually organize this into a system. And in the absence of what K-12 does to organize their system, quality improvement and rating system have actually made great strides for developing the system for early learning. The notion of a quality improvement rating system is that in some states it's voluntary, in other states it is mandatory as part of licensing. But the notion is that you have this stratified definition of quality from maybe basic licensing, and it's measured by stars up to the 5th star, which is the highest form of quality that there can be. And it gives parents transparency. It gives programs a clear path to shoot towards quality. I would tell you that we're probably on quality improvement rating systems 3.0 right now as a field, and trying to figure out how to measure it right, how to include the diversity that we need to include, how to align the standards and assessment. And so if you're in a state that is working on a quality improvement and rating system, and a lot of the Race to the Top states initiated their quality improvement and rating system as part of Race to the Top, I would urge you to think about a few policy items that are really essential in moving this organizing principle forward. One of them is the consistency and transparency in the system. You've got to have clear paths to quality, and every single program has to know and see themselves how they fit into the quality improvement and rating system. There's got to be integrity in the measurements. There's got to be validity and inter-rater reliability in how the system is measured. It can't just be we're rating ourselves, which some systems are. We're rating ourselves, or we don't have the funding to make sure that there's inter-rater reliability, so it's kind of all over the map. And that leads to this program down the street got a 4-star, I got a 2-star, and we're doing the exact same things. There's got to be validity and integrity in the system. You also have to be clear on what you're trying to impact. And I would say this, quite frankly, is what gives me the most heartburn about what I see with quality rating systems right now across the country, is some systems are saying where we're headed is we want to change 3rd grade literacy scores. Some are saying we want to change kindergarten entry levels as a result of our quality rating system. Others are saying, well, we just want to make sure that families can access programs and services better. And then when you structure the system, it doesn't align to those goals. And so being really dogged about making sure that there's alignment in what you're trying to accomplish is absolutely essential. And then the final part I would say about quality improvement and rating systems is that you've got to be investing the right resources. And I thought about that when I was listening to this Common Core discussion earlier, and this notion that it's not the standards themselves, but it's about implementation. I think that there's a lot of alignment between that and what we're seeing in quality improvement rating systems across the country, in that You've got the standards, you've defined what quality is, it's evidence-based, but to really get teachers to where they need to feel confident and comfortable in leading in that kind of a classroom environment, or to get parents to a point where they understand what to look for in quality, or they're trying to figure out how to navigate this early learning market space and what that looks like. To be able to do that well, or to move programs from a 1-star to a 5-star, it can't be the spray and pray. It can't be, we call them drive-by trainings. It has to be coaching. It has to be intentional, ongoing professional development supports, and that's expensive. That costs money. And so to implement Common Core, to implement quality improvement and rating systems, it can't be done on the cheap. The investments have to be made to really get to the workforce and programs to a level of sophistication that really implement the kind of quality that we know changes kindergarten outcomes. So I wanted to leave some time for questions this morning, and I would just close with a couple of things. First off, you know, you all are, I sit here and think about the position you're all in, and it's an enviable position because regardless of the topic that we're on, there's always much greater need than there are resources to meet those needs. And I think that's the plight of choosing the public sector or becoming an elected official. And so the thing I would leave you with is that as you work to create scale and alignment with K-12, I really believe that much can be derived from what we know and have learned to be the best in early childhood education. Our field does assessment really well. Our field embraces parent choice really well. Our field knows and has for decades what individual instruction looks like. We call it developmentally appropriate practice, and we do it really well. Our field knows what project-based learning is, and to get a group of children in the middle of a room with just a set of blocks and have them create a complex city out of it or complex learning structure. Our field knows how to do that really, really well. Our field knows what experiential learning is, to take a Common Core state standard that's about sequencing and realizing you can go teach it in the mud, that is what is developmentally appropriate, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be sitting at a desk looking at a worksheet. Our field has embraced that concept forever, for a very long time. We know what drives quality. We know how to create these environments for the young children. So I would strongly urge you to not just simply replicate or cut and paste K-12 education. There's some awesome items in K-12 education that we have a lot to learn from, particularly the organizing principle of scale. But I would urge you to think about this opportunity, this maker learning opportunity, this moment to forge a path that is designed with minimal but absolutely essential compliance recommendations that are focused on building quality, that rewards innovation, and that strives for the level of scale where we can, across the country, point to real, measurable child-level outcomes. Thank you very much for having me this morning. I believe I have a little time to answer any questions that you may have. Stunned silence.
Thanks. So I know you're talking, I was just really curious what amount of time in the day? Are you talking a 2-hour, a morning, an afternoon, an all day for these pre-K? And are you talking from infants in their arms to the older 5-year-olds? I just sort of wanted some of the practical thoughts of what you were imagining.
Yeah. So I would start with the early learning system is from birth through age 8. That's how we think about it. And so when you're talking about the time and the dosage, it's between when a child is born to when they begin kindergarten. And I think that the difference in those age bands is why we have such a diverse marketplace related to what makes most sense for kids in those age groups. For children who their parents work, which is many of the children in this country, they need full day, full year care, whether or not they are 6 weeks old is when we say you have to go back to work, so 6 weeks old to the day they enter kindergarten. As states are thinking about building their early learning systems and focusing on this notion of high quality early learning, I would submit to you that you can't do it without thinking about blending these funding streams, because a part day, 2 hour a day, part year preschool program, to your point, with a dosage of a couple hours, isn't going to, if we want kindergarten readiness, third grade reading, higher graduation rates, that in and of itself isn't going to push the system together. So as policymakers, I would argue that we've got to be thinking about full year, full day, and it's got to be built on parent choice, and it's got to be built on what families need. So there's variation in that.
As a former leader of a large school district in Ferguson, Missouri, having about 3,000 early childhood people, and where early childhood and parents as teachers was started in Missouri, but also having a daycare from a church that we founded, and being the chair of the Urban League with Head Start, I want to know your efforts for national accountability on assessments for early learners so that there's some even benchmark. That's number one. Number two, also how to promote the mathematics and critical thinking in a measurable way, because we know about the word gap, but we don't have much on the mathematics and literacy gap. Yeah. So speak to that if you would.
Those are great questions. First off, I would urge you to look at, we have a position statement on assessment and young children. It to me, lays out all of the principles around how to do assessment right with young kids. You can download it off of our website. We have a number of position statements on related topics. We also put out a number of publications and resources and books. We just did one on the alignment between standards and assessment and standards and developmentally appropriate practice and what that looks like. So there's a number of resources related to that. The other piece, though, that I would give you a glimpse into where we're headed is around raising the floor of professional preparation. And we believe at NAEYC that there has to be, that item cannot be done state by state by state, that as a professional field, we have to come together and say, there's a floor of competencies, of knowledge and skills that you as an early childhood educator, regardless of what setting you're in, regardless of the setting, have to know and be able to do in order to be a competent early childhood educator. And maybe it starts with a child development certificate and then goes up to a PhD. But we've never done that as a field of early learning. We've never said this is the floor of competency that is required in order to reach this level of quality that we're talking about. And so we're actually about to launch a significant initiative related to defining those competencies in the field of early learning. Thank you all very much.